Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer. Very somber encore presentation of the Florida History Podcast we're going to do today as Jimmy Carter has passed away at the age of 100. Happy holidays, everyone. Happy New Year to everyone. Also, a little bit of promotional um, information. My book about the War of 1812 in Florida is being published on January 2nd. It will be available from Amazon.com. The book is much better formatted and has a professional look to it, unlike some of the previous books I published, self-published. And on that note, also, we have a second edition of Florida and the British, which was the first book I published, self-published, using now the new publishing software and it has a more professional look. It also has much more information, added new photos, and added more layers of information to that book. Robert and I are also working on a book on the American Revolution that's being published by Casemate, a UK-based publisher, and that will be out in over the summer in the United Kingdom. Should be late in 2025 here in the United States. So both of your co-hosts of the Florida History Podcast, working on that, and I also have a book where I'm working on long term on the War of Jenkins' Ear and Queen Anne's War in Florida. Doing research for that now. There'll be some of what's in Florida and the British also in that book, but a lot more detailed information about those conflicts. So that's what's been going on at the Florida History Podcast and Florida Squeeze Publishing House, a Florida Squeeze publication. But today, instead of continuing with our governor series, we're going to play an encore presentation from 2021, a podcast we taped about Jimmy Carter and Florida. Happy New Year, everyone. Happy holidays. And all the best to everyone out there. Jimmy Carter, truly great man that we lost at the age of 100, President Jimmy Carter. Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So, Robert, we're in the holiday season of 2021/2022, and I've been reading a lot in recent weeks about Richard Nixon, and the inevitable conclusion of reading about Richard Nixon and Watergate is to look at the 1976 election, which Jimmy Carter was elected. And you've written a book about Jimmy Carter. You have produced a documentary for us at the Florida Squeeze, which we'll link to, about Jimmy Carter's 1976 campaign. Let's talk specifically about Jimmy Carter in Florida, because Florida was a state which he won in 1976, but then got crushed in 1980 in a way he didn't. There wasn't that sort of reversal from one state to another quite like Florida in the country, quite honestly. He ran a few points worse in most places than he did in 80 than he did in 76. And obviously, John Anderson, who was a liberal Republican, was running as a third-party candidate, took away some votes on the left. But no place did his vote collapse from 52% to 39% statewide like it did in Florida. And I guess there is an explanation. So take us through 76 first. Carter wins the Florida primary. I guess I should mention that first. Carter won the nomination largely because he won the Florida primary. It was a huge primary in 1976, and then he wins the state in the general election.
So, Carter, he decided to announce that he was going to run for president about a solid 2 years before the actual nomination. So, he kind of ran nonstop, no holds barred for, about 22 months. And in that time, the main focus during the start of the primary, was one for him to hit every single primary or caucus, which, at the time, that was not really done for the most part. Candidates did not, they would do like a handful and go in.
And actually, I'll just jump in for a second and say, for example, in 1968, Hubert Humphrey didn't run in a single primary. He had run in 1960 in primaries and had been beaten famously by John Kennedy in West Virginia, which ended his candidacy. 1968, with the backing of Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president, Humphrey didn't run in a single primary, and he won the nomination, which was, in hindsight, absurd. But so, yeah, to your point, 1976, Carter does something very different.
Yeah, and basically, it was the beginning of what would end up being your standard modern presidential run. The rules had changed, so there was a lot more power in the delegates that you would obtain from primaries. And so his main focus was to win in the Iowa caucus, which didn't really have any delegates, but it would be a way to show that he was a winner. Then he would win in New Hampshire, which would be the first primary, and he would use that momentum to then win in Florida. Now, Florida at the time was under the sort of specter of George Wallace, who was kind of this lead balloon around the neck of the Democrats. He would sort of divide the vote and sort of weigh it down, and as a result, they were having difficulties at the national level, chiefly in '68 when he ran as an independent. So the party had basically a unspoken gentleman's agreement that they would leave Florida to Carter, that Carter would be seen as the alternative to basically smother Wallace's, third run for president.
So the context on this,
in Florida.
Yeah. So real quickly, Robert, the context on this was in '64, Wallace had run for president, had done very well in the Maryland primary against Lyndon Johnson, against the sitting president. '68, obviously, you mentioned he ran as an independent and won several southern states. He won Georgia. He won obviously his home state of Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. He won. '72, he was seen before the shooting in Maryland. Was seen as kind of yesterday's news. He comes to Florida. The national media talks about how northern Florida is, how it's not really a southern state, but everyone else is running hard in Florida, right? Scoop Jackson's thinking he's going to win a lot of Jewish votes in South Florida. Scoop Jackson is kind of the godfather of the neoconservative movement, which I don't want to mischaracterize it, because Scoop Jackson actually was very liberal on economic issues, but he had this Cold Warrior streak, which is why the Bill Kristols and the people we associate with the neoconservative movement were actually Scoop Jackson Democrats before they were Reagan and Bush Republicans. Now they're Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden Democrats, but they flip back to the Democratic Party, a lot of those people. But Scoop Jackson runs. John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, runs, thinking he's going to get a lot of the New York retiree votes. He comes to Florida and campaigns. Hubert Humphrey campaigns in Florida, and Ed Muskie campaigns in Florida. So George Wallace won 42% of the vote in Florida. He had won every county except for Miami-Dade County and I believe Alachua. But the bottom line was he still was under 50%. So it was a resounding defeat for the Democratic establishment and a resounding victory for this anti-busing. By that time, Wallace had shifted from segregation to busing as his key issue, in crime, right? Busing, crime, that sort of stuff. Those coded words, kind of the angry resistance to integration. But he had still gotten under 50% of the vote. So to your point, the Democratic leadership led by Bob Strauss, the chairman of the DNC from Texas, made a tactical decision that Larry O'Brien, who had been the DNC chair, former Kennedy and Johnson aide, did not make in '72, which was, okay, let's keep all the northern candidates out of Florida and let's give the other southerner a straight shot at Wallace. So continue.
And so basically, Carter would run. He would run every single day in one of those three states, but so did his wife, so did his mother, his children, his siblings. So in effect, you actually had about 18 Carter campaigns that were traveling all across the country every single day. And Rosalynn was assigned Florida, and she actually sent over, I think it was like 150 days in Florida campaigning.
Wow.
Leading up to the primary. She was really, really driven to do that. And, the added bonus of all of this is the fact that, Florida, when it comes to Plains, Georgia, it's a difference of about 90 minutes. And then you're in Florida. So it was very easy to kind of compete in the panhandle for a day and then go back. And so at the end result was everybody just assumed that Carter would win in Florida, and then they would be able to sort of smother him in the North. When in actuality, by the time that he won Florida from Wallace, he was, he had the momentum of, okay, I'm the winner. And simultaneously, what is so impressive about Carter's Florida campaign was that he was simultaneously running in 3 other northern states, and he actually won another northern state. So not only did he manage to beat Wallace to have this sort of healthy, more acceptable southern alternative to Wallace, but in the same sense, he was able to undercut a lot of the criticism that Wallace was given, that he was this regional candidate. So he was able to say, not only am I not racist, I'm not regional. And so you get into 1976, and one thing that any person that looks at the 76 Electoral College map will notice is that Carter wins everything in the Mason-Dixon line, basically. And a big reason why is because the South had a real animosity towards the North still. It was sort of ingrained in them that, we're different, we're not welcome, we've lost, we're still sort of the redheaded stepchilds of, the North and the frontier West. And, you got to remember, Jimmy Carter was raised in a time period where his grandparents remembered the Civil War. So it's not really a question of, it being nowadays where it was just something that happened and nobody knew was alive at the time period. It was still a relatively fresh event. I mean, it'd be the same thing as, your child talking to a grandparent that was in World War II. So it was a real event. And as a result, you had, for the first time in over 100 years, this candidate who looked like he was going to win the presidency, who was from the Deep South. The last president from the Deep South that ran in a home base in the Deep South was Zachary Taylor, which was in the 1840s. So this was a kind of a pridal thing for a lot of Southerners. They took a lot of pride in the fact that they were sort of rejoining the Union. So as a result, there was a lot of people, especially in a state like Mississippi, that never voted Democrat, that voted specifically because they wanted to see a Southern president.
Yeah, I should point out real quickly the previous Southerner, sort of Southerner. I would consider him more kind of a Southwesterner that had been nominated by the Democrats was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. He got 13% of the vote in Mississippi. He got beat by Goldwater 87-13. Now, granted, that was before the Voting Rights Act, so that was an almost entirely white electorate. But think about that: 13% of the vote in 64. 76, you run an actual deep person from the Deep South. And Humphrey's percentage in Mississippi was a little higher because black African Americans could vote. McGovern got, I think, like 20%, similar to Johnson's 13% in Mississippi. And then in 76, Carter wins Mississippi. It's just remarkable. Continue. I just felt like that's an important data point.
And so, the same sense happened in Florida where as soon as the polls closed, it was called for Carter. He won basically everywhere. So when you look at what the heck happened from 76 to 80, that's the first clue, is the fact that the sort of shine was off of Carter. It was, okay, well, we've had a Southern president, let's move on. They didn't feel as though they had to, give him a second term the way that they felt that they had to really vote hard for him in 76.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, but in terms of Florida, the other few aspects that you have to look at that really affected him greatly was in the Panhandle in Central Florida, he did not win the Protestant vote. Mm-hmm. And in South Florida, he did not win the Jewish vote. He had huge deficits nationally in both of those two very important demographics. And they were actually what won him the presidency in 76. He was the last Democrat to win a majority of the Protestant vote. And so basically it was just a situation where in 76 he won Florida, he won the South, he won the presidency, and he had all of these different things that all went right for him that so easily could have been turned the other way and could have denied him the presidency. And basically 80, you just saw everything bouncing back away from him. And so, just even though you see this southern sea of blue for Carter, a lot of these different states could very easily have been red and would be red 4 years later.
Yeah, but I think the key thing about Florida is if you look at Mississippi, Carter fell from like 52 to 47. In Alabama, he fell from like 50, low 50s to 48. He almost won Alabama in 80 still. He got 48% in South Carolina. He got 46 or so in Louisiana. He was very close to winning Arkansas. Actually, lost Arkansas by 5,000 votes. Tennessee, Kentucky were also close. But Florida and also Texas, Carter had won in 76. He's the last Democrat to carry Texas. The vote collapsed. So there are two big events, Robert, in that period in Florida-specific events. One was the Dade County Ordinance on LGBT rights, which we are going to get back to in another podcast. That deserves a whole podcast. But that became a big national event with Anita Bryant, and I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with it. That ended up galvanizing maybe it didn't hurt Carter as much as it really organized conservatives who would back Reagan in 80 and who had been maybe less organized in Florida in 76. And then Marielle in 1980, which I guess in many ways was the flashpoint under which that 80 race was run. And in fact, Bill Clinton blamed Jimmy Carter. Marielle refugees were sent to Arkansas, right? I just said Carter actually lost Arkansas by 5,000 votes, which is less votes than Bill Clinton lost the governorship by that year.
Yeah.
But Clinton proceeded to blame Carter for his loss, which Carter actually ran ahead of Clinton, as I said. But whatever. But it was a flashpoint is the point.
Which, I mean, basically the reason, just anecdotally, the reason why Bill Clinton lost was because he raised the license tag.
Yes.
From about $19 to $35, which was a huge increase to pay for the roads. And you could actually make the point that Carter actually lost to Arkansas because Bill Clinton wasn't as strong as he should have.
Correct.
Which, that was back in the day where, especially in the South, the president wasn't really the top of the ticket. It was basically the governor or the senator that was running, and the president sort of ran along with them, So, did a huge disservice to Carter. But as far as Florida is concerned, too, and this is something that we never really talk about, one is the fact that in 76, the Democratic Party was a lot more united than they were in 80. And another real major issue is the fact that we had a very bloody 78 Senate race, which alienated a lot of Democrats from themselves. And then that sort of led into an even bloodier 1980 primary between Carter and Kennedy. So you basically had in 1980, you had Bob Graham and Wayne Nixon basically campaigning almost alone for Carter. And they worked their butts off to try and bring the state for Carter. And, Carter actually came to the state. He stayed in the governor's mansion, made his own bed when he was done with it. But the powerhouse that was there 4 years ago, the United Democratic statewide office holders that would come and they would stump hard for him, just wasn't there. He didn't have the kind of connection with legislators that he had formed 4 years earlier, because they were all gone by 1980. So it was a very different state as well.
How much did Ted Kennedy's primary challenge to Carter, and then Jerry Brown jumped in later, but he didn't really compete in Florida. But so Kennedy in Florida, obviously Carter wins the primary, but how much did that hurt kind of the goodwill?
Well, you were saying earlier that Carter almost won Alabama, and the actual oddity about this is that Reagan won about 10 states by only about a point or two.
Yeah. Mostly in the South.
Yeah,
like Tennessee, Kentucky, all of those states we mentioned. South Carolina, very close.
And so, Anderson, I think, made the difference in a lot of these states that 4 years ago, Carter won by about a point or so, or half a point, or 2 points. And that was sort of eaten up by Anderson. And Anderson, I think, that's where a lot of the Kennedy supporters went to. And so, that was a real crushing blow for him. But then you have this situation where, whenever you're an incumbent and you're having to spend money and time to beat a challenger, that's going to suck. That's going to take away from what you should be doing, which is looking presidential and having a massive war chest that you can then go and pummel your fellow challenger who has come out of the primaries, usually bloody or tired or weak or what have you. And that was not the case. But I tell you, one of the great ironies about 80 and 76 is the fact that the two winners of both of those elections, Carter and Reagan, you could actually make the assumption that they actually ran bad fall campaigns. Ford and Carter actually ran better campaigns in the fall, and very easily, both of these incumbent presidents, if there was just a few factors that were different, could have very easily had won the election. So 1980 was just a very bad year for Carter, and Ted Kennedy was just another instance where it was just another thing against the scales. And unfortunately, with Ted Kennedy, you had a lot of transplant Democrats that were more liberal, that just did not align with Carter, and you saw a lot of friction between the various coalitions that made up the rather large Democratic Party in Florida.
Robert, thank you once again, and as always, you could find us online at the Florida Squeeze and at the Florida History Podcast, wherever you find podcasts.